how did your background in the theater help you as a director?
Well, I had a lot of experience working with actors, which was one of the biggest, strengths I think that I got from working in theater, as well as working with playwrights, writers. So all of that was very useful to me. And we did a lot of plays that were kind of fantasy or horror based, and we did effects and doing them live on stage. Was a lot of those effects were used in Re-Animator, which was my first film. I didn't know anything about filmmaking, and even the most basic things, about screen direction and crossing the line and all that kind of stuff. And luckily, I had a very good director of photography, Mac Alberg, who I still called the professor because he kind of gave me like a crash course in filmmaking.
Your first film, Re-Animator, and it's a classic, not just, because it's an awesome movie, but it's because it's got a combination of, extreme gore, sexuality, and of course the macabre sort of dark humor. And the film masterfully sort of balances gross out horror and macabre humor in a lot of ways. And I was wondering, why is laughter such an important element in horror films?
Well, you'll never find an audience that wants to laugh more than a horror movie audience. And I think it's because it's their effort to relieve the tension. So laughter is the antidote to fear. So they're always trying to find something that they can laugh at. And I always thought it was a good idea to give them something that's not going to be at the expense of the movie. You don't want them laughing at your monster or, thinking that the whole movie is ridiculous. So, it's great to have those moments where you can kind of break the tension with a laugh and then start cranking up, the suspense again. A good example is a movie like Jaws, where they have that great scene with the, we need a bigger boat line coming in, which breaks the tension of seeing that huge shark head coming out of the water. And it gets a huge laugh, and then, you're right back into the danger again. But it's, it's coming out of the humor comes out of the characters. It's not a winking at the audience. It's, you have to be very careful because, if you try to do horror and comedy at the same time, they kind of cancel each other out.
Yeah, that's why Re-Animate, it works so well, and it's like a lot of other filmmakers have tried to put that comedy in there with the horror, and like you said, sometimes you end up laughing at them in places where they, where they're not really supposed to laugh. Yeah, it's like, so,
and I think it really is about keeping. I think you got to take the movie seriously. I think the audiences want you to do that. If they sense that the director, the movie maker thinks that the whole thing is silly, or that he's slumming by doing a horror movie, then they will have nothing to do with it. They really want it to know that the people who made the movie are fans of the genre and take it seriously.
Now, how important is sexuality in horror films?
Well, I always feel like sex and horror go hand in hand. That they basically are two sides of the same coin, and that you go back to some of the old drawings, going back to the Middle Ages, and there were these pictures that were called Death and the Maiden, and it usually was a picture of the character Death, which is usually portrayed as sort of a skeleton, and he would be caressing a beautiful naked woman. And, I think what it is, it's life and death. Sex really symbolizes life and procreating. And horror movies are really all about death as well. So it's the conflict between the two. So, I think there is it's even in the oldest horror movies, there's always those scenes of the monster picking up the woman and carrying her off, They didn't used to show you what happened once he carried them off, but now we do. And although I'm sensing, it's kind of interesting, I'm sensing kind of a backlash happening recently where there's a kind of puritanical, kids are getting very puritanical. And one of my movies, I was looking at some of the comments about it on IMDb, and one of them was, how bad is the nudity? And it was kind of like, bad? Nudity? You know, it's like, it didn't compute in my head. And it was somebody who was worried about, you know, he wanted to watch it with his girlfriend, but he was afraid that if it was too sexually explicit, that she'd be, think that he was a pervert or something. And it was like, it was just weird. So I think now it's kind of odd that there's a sort of a anti-sex in horror movies feeling, I think, as well.
Yeah, to it.
Well, Roger Corman used to, you know, he had like a formula, and he would say there has to be like a nudity or a killing every 10 minutes in a movie. You know, it's kind of like, you know, we have to see some tits, you know, at 20 minutes in, and we've got to see this. And it was like he had it all sort of worked out. And he was very, very firm with the director, saying, okay, now you've got to follow these, you know, these rules. But I'm not so sure that, you know, I think things are changing, and you know, my feeling is that if there's a reason for the nudity, you know, in terms of the story and so forth, you're fine, do it.
Yeah.
But if it's something, if the audience starts feeling like you're doing it just to be, you know, kind of, adding some TNA to your movie, then they kind of turn off to that.
Yeah, just to have it in there instead of having at least some kind of motivation behind it, you know, and but for you, what are the mechanics for a successful scare, like in a film? Like if from your perspective as a director, what like if you could break it down to what makes a successful scare, what would that be?
Well, you know, it depends on what you're calling a scare, you know, because, you know, Stephen King once had a real good thing where he was talking about, he said the strongest emotion that you can create in a horror, you know, and he was talking about his stories, but I think it's true of movies as well, is that, you know, he said the sense of dread is this overriding sense of something awful is going to be happening. That's true horror. And he said that, you know, then he said the next thing is shock, which is when something jumps out at you and you jump out of your seat and, you know, boo kind of thing. And then he said if you can't, then the next level after that, you know, if you can't, is gross out. You know, something that's just really disgusting, where you just go, ugh. You know, and so it was, you know, those are kind of like the way he sort of broke it down. But I think that it's about, for me, scaring the audience, I think, has to do with the audience I think it's important that they care about the characters in the story. That you create characters that they sympathize with and actually identify with and in a sense become those characters. And then when you put those characters into a dangerous situation, then they start really getting scared for them. If they don't care, you know, like that was one of my problems about the old... well, now they're doing them again, the Friday the 13th movies. The kids in those movies are so, you know, they're just kind of brats, and it's like, who cares if they get killed? You're just sort of waiting. You can't wait to see them get murdered.
Exactly.
And, you know, it's not scary. But, you know, when it's a character like, you know, you know, just saw this movie called The Orphanage, and the woman that in that movie, you know, was sort of moving back into the orphanage where she had been a child, you know, and it's haunted, and you really care about her, and you really start, you know, it really gets very creepy and builds an incredible amount of tension. So I think I think that's the main thing. You know, the shocks, you know, making somebody jump, and I have to be honest and say that that's never really been one of my strong suits. I think it's kind of like, it's sort of like misdirection, I think, is part of it, where you think that something's going to happen over here, but it happens over there instead. You know, but again, I think it has to do with the audience knowing that something is going to happen. You know, feeling that, you know, when they're going into the house or whatever, down into the basement, that, you know, any second something is going to come leaping out at them, and you just have to sort of play with the audience and their expectations.
I mean, for new directors, what do you think is the best way for a new director, somebody that's just coming in to wants to be a filmmaker or a director, to communicate with an actor on the set? You know, what is it that actors, you know, really want from a director?
Well, I think they want. I think it's helpful if the director knows, sort of what goes into acting. And I always advise new directors to actually do some acting, and to maybe do some theater or to take some acting classes, so that when they speak to the actors, they are speaking the same language, and they know the terms, and the actor gets a sense that, well, this guy knows what I'm going through here, and what he's saying is helping me. There's nothing worse than a director who gives you all this information, but it really is useless in terms of it doesn't really, it's not playable. And the thing that I've learned over the years is that it's really the best thing to do is to kind of ask questions to the actor and let him solve the problem, so it's coming from him. You ask questions about, what would you do if this were to happen? Put it in, and an actor always has to believe that this is all really happening to him, and he has to kind of put himself into that situation, and giving an actor a direction saying be more scared isn't really helpful, because you're just giving him sort of the results of what you're looking for, as opposed to what is it about the situation that would scare you, and and sometimes you do the what if situation. What if you were being followed by somebody, and you could hear the person's breathing, and it didn't sound like a person. It sounded more like an animal. And then you're putting their imaginations to work, and they can start imagining this and start putting themselves into that situation. So I think it's good directors don't say a lot to the actors, but they say just enough, and they encourage them. I think the director is kind of like the surrogate audience for the actor, and so I always think it's important that the director is encouraging and says, "Wow, that was fantastic. You're doing great." Put the actor at ease. I think people, do their best work when they're relaxed, and so I think you have to create a comfortable environment on the set, where even though you're under a lot of pressure to work quickly, you never really try to rush the actor. You always let the actor feel like he's got all the time in the world to do what he has to do.
Yeah.
But I think it's really helpful for I think in movie making, the actor is the most important part of the process. It's really all about the acting for me. I mean, the technical side of it is important, but I think movies have really always been about, the actors, and that's why, movie stars are so powerful in Hollywood. Because it's really, audiences really, they almost become like family to the audience. And, we care about them. I think also what sometimes is fun is just be able to say, look, we got it, that take was really good, we're there, why don't we do one more just for, for fun, and try something crazy. Maybe sometimes, doing something, instead of doing what's the obvious reaction to something, do something different, and let the actor feel that he can, just kind of let loose with something, so surprise you. And sometimes those are great. I always listen when an actor says, "Can we do one more take?" Even if I feel like we've got it, because the actor will sometimes say, "You know what? Let me try that again. I think I can do it better." And I always say, "Sure, let's go." One of the things that I learned from Mac Alberg was that what takes the time is setting up the shot. The actual shooting of it is really the quickest part. And so that's not where you really need to rush. And don't settle for something that you're not really not crazy about, because you're gonna have to live with that for forever. And take another take or two, even if it can't hurt if the actor sometimes the actor will give you something far better than anything you ever imagined.
Yes. When directing horror films, is there what criteria do you use when determining where to put the camera in a scene?
Well, I always the best answer I ever heard to that came from Steven Spielberg, who said that, you know, when he likes to rehearse with the actors, which is another thing I would recommend too.
Yeah.
To rehearse before you start shooting, like a week before you start shooting, spend some time with them and go over things and kind of work things out, because you don't want to take time on the set to start discussing a character's motivation, you know. So you've kind of done a lot of the basic work before you even start shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But he always says that he kind of puts the camera where he sits to watch the rehearsal. You know, where he puts himself to see everything that's going on. And I think that's kind of a very practical way to look at it. I also was very influenced on Re-Animator by Roman Polanski's work, because the way he shoots movies, he really makes his movies are very subjective. He really makes the audience feel like they are a character in the film, and it's almost like the audience or the camera is kind of looking over someone's shoulder, or kind of following someone, or you really get a sense of kind of after a while in his movies, it's almost like the camera becomes the main character, because it's usually like right over the shoulder of the protagonist. And that's kind of one of my favorite shots. I use it all the time, is the over the shoulder shot. Because it really, it's almost, it gives the audience a real sense of being in the movie rather than watching it, from a distance. And Hitchcock had a great line too. He said, I want to be on the train. I don't want to be a cow in the pasture watching the train go by.
That's a good one. I like that. I wanted to get that embroidered on a shirt or something. Right?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, he always got into, one of the things that Hitchcock hated were these kind of crazy sort of hot dog shots, he would call it, where like the camera's in the fireplace. You see that in a lot of movies where the flames are in the foreground.
Yeah.
And the actors are kind of, pushing a poker into towards the camera. Right. And he would always go, "Why am I in the fire? Why are you putting the audience in the fire?" The positioning of the camera really can have a huge effect on how the audience, sort of takes in the scene. Yeah. And sometimes you can make the audience feel like sort of omnipotent if the camera is like on a high position looking down, or sometimes the characters tower over them. Like in Citizen Kane, I was noticing Orson Welles loves to put the camera like on the floor, really low angles, and the characters become these sort of towering, sort of gigantic figures. Yeah. And it gives an emotional effect to everything. And in Kane, since it's about these kind of titans of industry, it really works.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It just seems like nowadays, with some of the more modern horror films and with the styles and that they're using, not just in the camera work, but also in the editing, with this sort of, just this staccato, like flash cutting, really, really cut, and just really crazy camera work almost all the time, in a lot of different modern horror films. And that's one thing that I don't personally like, but and I know I tried to stay away from all that on my last movie, and it was just okay, the camera's here, it's here, we're not doing, it's not gonna go for that sort of, it's not a music video, you know what I mean? I feel like a lot of stuff
I think there's a changing sort of sensibility, a style change that's taken place, which is, that fast cutting and editing stuff with those jump cuts and things. To me, they just make me aware of the process. It reminds me that there's an editor. It reminds me that there's a cameraman. I'm seeing the crew. Because I become aware of the process too much. What I like in movies is when you forget even that you're watching a movie. Yeah. You just sort of you just let it. You're there. You're in it, and it's like the goal used to be that you want to. The director wants to become invisible. You want the actor. You don't want to forget that these are actors. You want to forget that there's a script. When you start saying to yourself, "Wow, what a great shot!" Yeah, you're out of the movie.
Yeah, totally.
you know.
Or God, that was really cool how they they flash cut 1,000 images in there.
Yeah.
Somebody died, or or that. Totally. I mean, it's like Rosemary's Baby. I mean, when you watch Rosemary's Baby, I mean, it's like, it's just you don't know, you're there, you're in that movie. You don't feel like.
I mean, I was watching Dr. Strangelove the other day, and there's entire scenes that are just one camera, just sitting. The camera doesn't even move.
Yeah.
And he just lets the actors do it all.
Oh, yeah. Kubrick's like the master of that stuff when it's Shining and all that. Oh man. I mean, it just. Oh, anyway.
He just lets it play out. And I used to think, and I think there is some truth in this, is that every time you cut in a movie, you have an edit. There's a disturbance kind of in the forces. George Lucas would say, it's like you're interrupting the flow. And that the more you can go with a shot where you don't have any cuts in it, in a way, the stronger it is, I think.
Yeah.
But I think one of the other things I've learned is that horror is slow. Horror really is not. It's fast cutting is like for action sequences or something.
Yeah, totally.
But horror is about anticipation and about. So the longer you can stretch something out, someone's walking up a flight of stairs, the longer it takes them to walk up those stairs, because something is at the top of the stairs that's going to get them.
Yeah.
The better. It's like you want it to things to slow down. I read somewhere that David Cronenberg, when he makes movies, his scripts are very short. They're like 75 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because he knows that he's going to really play things as slowly as he possibly can.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, totally. Cronenberg's another master at that.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, God, I just hope, one day, in the next couple movies, one of these days I'll get all these, after, 5 or 6 of the crazy movies I've made, I'll finally get it right one of these times as far as...
you've gotten it right.
I mean, get it right as far as, just, okay, this is perfect, this is exactly, no flash cutting here, no damn, no low budget, doing this to cover up the bad makeup effects or whatever. I don't know. But I'm still working on it. I don't know. I'm getting there, I guess.
Well, we all are. That's one of the things I loved when Kurosawa was being given a special Academy Award. He said, I'm a film student. And, he was 75 years old at the time. And it was like, that's sort of the way we all are. We're all students, and we're all trying to get it right.
Do you storyboard? And if so, why is it important to you?
I do storyboard, but not everything. I storyboard effect sequences, and sometimes I'll storyboard stunt scenes, because it's important to be able to show the various departments what exactly you've got in mind and how you're planning on shooting it.
Mm-hmm.
And with like effects, or like a prosthetics or mechanical effect, they know where the camera's going to be, so they know where they can hide the machinery, or how they can accomplish the shot.
Mm-hmm.
And like in From Beyond, which was one of the early movies I did, we had to, we had this effect where this thing was coming out of this guy's forehead, and sometimes, we would have to use a dummy, but sometimes if the shot was from the side, we could actually use the actor, and there was a way to kind of push the thing out from the side that was away from the camera. You could have, actually people were puppeting stuff there, and for them to be able to figure that out, they really had to see a drawing of how you were planning on shooting it. And sometimes it's a good idea to sit down with the effects guys even before you storyboard, so you know what the techniques are that they're talking about. And, okay, this one will use this effect, and then this one will use that effect, and so forth. But I, usually don't storyboard everything, because I kind of like to see what the actors are going to do, and I don't want to, it's kind of, you don't want to get into a situation where you've storyboarded something and the actor says, you know what, I don't want to come in through the door, I want to come in through the window, and all of a sudden it's like all your storyboards are in the trash can.
Yeah.
I think that's why, again, rehearsals are really important and helpful too. I don't even do my shot list until after I've rehearsed with the actors.
Interesting. In today's digital revolution, there are more horror films than ever being made and sold out there. What do you think are some of the biggest mistakes you see in new filmmakers making when they're making horror films these days, if anything?
Well, I think a lot of movies I see are more concerned about the gore effects than they are about the actors and about the story. And the most important thing, and this is true of all movies, I don't think just horror movies, is the script. That you really have to get your script right and create a story that is involving and that every scene sort of builds to the next one and so forth. And you see a lot of really just movies where the scripts are just almost non-existent, and you can see that they've taken a lot of trouble with the effects and things. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of big, not just little movies, but huge Hollywood blockbusters sometimes, where they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars, but the script was wrong and the script was no good. They rushed it into production because they had to hit a delivery date or whatever, and there's nothing there really. And no matter how wonderful your actors are or your effects, if the script is bad, you're doomed.
Yep, that took me a couple movies to figure that one out. My first couple ones, I was like, "Oh, you mean I have to learn how to direct actors?" And I know everything there is to know about what button to push and what this does and what that does. But I'm scared of actors.
For me, it was the opposite for me. It was the actors I knew all about the actors, but I was constantly in Re-Animator. I always would end up in the shot. I didn't even know where to stand. It was like I ended up getting run over by the dolly a couple of times.
Oh, really?
It was it was ridiculous.
Oh, that's funny. But in your experience, what do you think are the most vital elements for that a horror film must have to be successful with an audience? Are there some three, maybe 3 or 4 different elements that a horror movie must have for it to be successful with an audience?
Well, I think some of the things I've said already about that there's a story with characters that you get involved with that you care about. I mean, I always think that's one of the most important things. And then I think it's coming up with something that's fresh. One of the things I see a lot are people who make movies about other movies, where they borrowed scenes from, this scene is from Alien, or the scene is from, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's like you feel like you're just seeing retreads of things you've seen a million times. What's important, I think, is to kind of come with something fresh, something that's something new. And I also think with horror films, one of the things you have to do is to sort of go beyond what's been done before in the past. That's what we tried to do with Re-Animator, with the scene that we always call the head gives head scene. We knew that scene was going to be a shocking scene because no one had ever done anything like that before, and it was sort of breaking some taboos. I think that horror movies, good horror movies, are transgressive. You're kind of doing some bad things. You're doing things that are taboo, and I think that's what you have to do. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got when I was working on Re-Animator, we were shooting that scene. One of the, I think it was like one of the art department people came up to me and said, you should go as far as you can with this scene. Don't hold back. Don't just push it as far as you can, which was excellent advice. And because you've got to do something, there's, like you said, there's so many horror movies that are out there. You've got to do something that separates yours from the rest of the pack. That does something that has people talking. Some people are going, I can't believe this movie, what I just saw in this film. It was unbelievably shocking or whatever. And it's always interesting because, time has a way of sort of dulling everything down. Movies that were amazingly shocking, like 20 or 30 years ago, or like I remember Night of the Living Dead was being shown only at midnight screenings, and it was considered incredibly, the scenes of the zombies eating the flesh and intestines and all this kind of stuff. No one had ever seen anything like that before, and it was like very, very disturbing. Now that movie is shown on uncut on television at 3:00 in the afternoon.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's not that scary anymore.
Well, except what I think the point what they forget is that it doesn't really matter if you're doing these terrible things to characters that don't seem like real people. Who are just sort of cardboard cutouts. What makes it disturbing is if it's happening to someone who you, as an audience member, have some kind of connection with. And, I always think about Psycho as being such a great example of how he sets up the whole story with Janet Leigh, and her predicament, with stealing the money from her company and being on the run and, and all this. He's got this whole storyline that builds up to her getting stabbed to death in the shower. Now, the stabbing in the shower, very famous scene, but that scene would not be as powerful as it is if he hadn't done all of the setup for it, and really gotten us on her side.
Yeah.
So when that scene happens, the audience feels like they're getting stabbed in the shower.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so upsetting.
Totally. For people that don't, go to film school or have a way, they're just going to sort of learn. They want to learn horror films, just by watching other horror films is always a great way to learn. But what would be three masterful horror films that you would suggest to aspiring filmmakers in the genre to study? And what would be your reason for each one? It doesn't have to be three. Maybe you have just two or one. Or
well, the one that, as I said, the one that was my film school was Rosemary's Baby, by Roman Polanski, and the way that movie was shot, it would, just really taught me a lot. There's a very famous story about one of the scenes in that movie where he's shooting one of the characters is on the phone in the bedroom, and and Rosemary's looking through the door at the guy. I think it's her husband who's on the phone, and he says to the cameraman, the cameraman's got the camera set up looking right through the door, and he says, "No, move the camera over to the right and so that the door is a little more off center, and we're not looking all the way straight through it." And the camera guy moves it, and he says, "No, move it a little more." And he keeps saying, "Now a little more, now a little more." And finally, it's like all that you see, you don't see the guy sitting on the phone, talking on the phone at all. You just see maybe like his knee, and when that scene was shown in the movie theaters, the whole audience starts tilting their heads to the left, trying to look through the door to see more, because he just teased them, he involved them, so much, and it was so subjective, and it's that kind of stuff in that movie that is just really, really creates this subjective feeling. I mean, his movie, The Pianist, did the same thing. It was about a guy who was hiding in an apartment during while the Nazis are taking over Warsaw, and the character never leaves his apartment. He can't, and there's all this action going on outside on the streets. But Polanski keeps us in the apartment, and everything is sort of a point of view from out of the window, looking down on the street. And sometimes you see almost nothing of what's going on out there. You just hear the sounds of people screaming and gunshots and all kinds of things, and it really creates a reality. So I mean, that was a great lesson for me.
He's a genius, isn't he? Polanski's work is just that's so incredible. I mean,
and he's all about taking, another famous story about him is in Chinatown. There's a scene where I think it's Nicholson's looking through a pair of binoculars at this guy who's like very far away, and the guy gets shot, and but the way it's shot, the way the thing happens is you see the guy fall down, and then you hear the gunshot, and when the sound editor said, shouldn't we hear the gunshot first before the guy falls down? And Polanski says, no, because light travels faster than sound. You'd see it before you'd hear it, which is the way things really work, and it's, that kind of reality and attention to detail really creates an incredible effect. You know, it's you have to, you know, he's a master at kind of putting himself into those, you know, and the audience into the situation in the middle of the movie. And I guess the other one, I guess, is you know, we talked about Psycho. That's, I think, is still my favorite horror movie of all time. And I think it's one of the great lessons in that is the thing about breaking rules. That Hitchcock broke one of the major rules of you know, storytelling by having his protagonist killed, you know, 30 minutes into the movie.
Yeah. Sure did.
You know, it's like you've never seen that happen before. And when that happens, you know, the idea of doing something like that's that audacious, you know, it panics the audience. You know, and I think once the audience is panicked, then it's like, you know, then they're easy to, you know, you keep them scared for the whole rest of the film. And, you know, I guess the third one I would choose would be Alien. Which does something similar too, which is that early in the film, like around the same point, around 30 minutes into the film, there's that great scene where the alien bursts out of the chest of John Hurt, and it is so shocking that you are panicked. You're thinking, "Oh my God, if they're doing something like this, you know, 30 minutes in, what are they going to be doing at 40 minutes in? You know, or 50 minutes? It's like, I don't know if they can handle this." As you know, as it turns out, that is the most shocking thing in the whole movie. But by putting it up at the front of the film, it creates this sense of, you know, dread, and it lets the, you know, the greatest tool that I think a filmmaker has is the audience's imagination. And if he can manipulate it and can kind of tease them and control them, you know, get their imagination spinning. You know, imagining, oh my God, what am I going to be seeing next, or what's going to happen next, or this guy, you know, sometimes you feel that way when it's with a great filmmaker like Cronenberg. You feel like, you know, I'm in the hands of a guy who is not going to stop where normally they stop. You know?
Yeah, totally.
You know, he's going to go way beyond anything I've ever seen before. And you get this. It's a sort of a weird feeling where you're excited and you're also, you know, like terrified. You know, like, oh my God, you know, can I handle this? Am I going to be able to take this? And, you know, that I think is really, you know, I think the goal of the filmmaker. You know, when you realize that the filmmaker is talented and smart and capable of anything, then you are really, and that you're in, you know, you're kind of under his spell and in his control. It's a great feeling. And the other thing about Alien that's a really good lesson is that they had this guy, you know, Giger, H.R. Giger, designing the creature, and it was a fantastic design. It was really, like, you know, one of the best creature designs ever. But Ridley Scott, the director, didn't show it to you. You know, he would keep, you know, in Alien, you don't see the whole monster until I think it's like one of the last shots of the movie, and you see little pieces of it. You see a little bit of its, you know, mouth, or a little bit of its hand, or a little bit of this or something, and it's like you're not even sure what you're looking at half the time. And you know, it makes it mysterious, and you know, I mean, one of the I'm sure other people have talked about this, but the idea that, you know, sort of once you show the monster, the movie's over. It's the fear of the unknown that is the strongest fear. That's what Lovecraft always used to say. And once the unknown becomes known, then you can handle it, no matter how, you know, grotesque it may be. You say, oh, okay, that's what it is. But when you're not sure what it is, that's when it's really scary.
In 2002, I produced and directed a film with you for Filmmaker Pictures. It was called Stuart Gordon Presents Deathbed, for a budget of only $35,000. Shot in 8
35, wow.
Days. Shot in 8 days. In LA. And as someone who, you know, regularly works on a lot of larger projects, studio films, this was probably somewhat of a different world that you sort of entered into when we were making this movie. And I was just wondering, you know, what kind of things did you learn working on an ultra super shoestring low budget level and the fast paced schedules. And what do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages of working this way?
Well, I learned a tremendous amount. That was a really good experience for me, because it was essentially how I felt like I was seeing the future of filmmaking. You know, I remember, the idea that you were living in an apartment complex, and so was sort of the rest of your crew. You know, and the movie, you were editing it in your bedroom, and then in the apartment next door they were doing the sound work, and I remember they were doing the Foley in the bathroom, and the actors were sitting on the toilet doing their lines.
I think Carolyn came over at one point.
Yeah,
helped us with some of that stuff.
yeah. It was the idea that all of the stuff with digital, in the digital world, in the digital era, was so it was possible to do things at such a tiny budget. When I did Re-Animator, we thought that was a low budget, and it was $800,000. And in those days that was a low budget, because you had to shoot on 35 millimeter, and you had to do all of this other stuff, and you had to have a crew, and you had to have big lights and all this stuff. And seeing how you worked on Deathbed was a revelation to me, and it made me realize that the whole world that I had known was about to change in a big way.
Did it kind of open up some possibilities as far as kind of being able to make your own films without necessarily going to DreamWorks or somebody to raise a couple $1 billion.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the next film that I did was King of the Ants, which was done for $350,000. Which was in that sort of digital world was like an enormous budget. And we were able to shoot for, I think on that one we shot for 30 days, something like that.
Yeah.
So it was, and now I think that's really where everything is headed. And that's why it's possible. I think movies can be made in people's credit cards. It seems like.
Yeah, but I'll
tell you what doesn't change. What won't ever change is the importance of story and strong performances. And imagination. I mean, that's really what you need, no matter what the format is, whether you're making a $200 million movie or a $200 movie. It really comes down to that script and those actors and the director and and being able to tell that story.
That's excellent advice. Definitely. I mean, with Deathbed, did you think? What were the disadvantages? The advantages are obviously, you got more control. You can do this, you do that, in a short amount of time. But as far as the disadvantages, what was it about making a movie on that in that time frame and that budget level that was a disadvantage, do you think?
I don't know. It's funny. One of the things I always tell students is that the problems are always the same, no matter what the size of your budget is, or no matter how many times. You never have enough time. You never have enough money, no matter how much you've got. James Cameron, when he did Titanic, wanted to build the whole Titanic full size, and he couldn't do it. He ended up with building half of it. Just one side of it. And, there was a scene where he had to show the other side, and he ended up doing this thing where he basically just kind of flipped the negative, and he shot things where he had all of the things, the writing, signage and everything written in mirror image, because he knew he was going to have to flip it. And, that he was essentially guerrilla filmmaking.
Wow.
In the middle of a $200 million film.
Yeah, really. Huh, interesting. I didn't know that.
It's true.
Wow. Well, that's very...
the opening scene, actually, it's the scene where the ship is in the dock and is going to leave, and everyone's boarding the ship.
Yeah.
that whole thing was shot with the negative flipped. You know, because it was the wrong side. The ship was facing the wrong way. Yeah. So well, it's funny. You know, my mother always used to say there's two ways to solve problems. One is to throw money at it, and one is to be clever. So you know,
yeah, totally. That's like the producer syndrome. Is like, you know, you're throwing money. I mean, anytime somebody brings her a problem, how much is it? You know, and it's like, okay, and you just throw the money at it. And
we'll fix it in post. I mean, that's when you hear that, you know, you're in trouble.
Oh, tell me about that. Yeah, that's my world. Yeah, exactly. All right, Stuart. We'll take care.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Wishes. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.